The most important event of the Stormlight Archive to date is the night that Gavilar was assassinated. It is the most pivotal moment upon which the entire thrust of the series lies, and we've gotten various retellings in the prologues from different perspectives, but today I'm going to pull it all together and try to reconstruct the full events of that night and see what we can learn. But if it isn't already clear, this video will include spoilers for all the Stormlight Archive up through the end of Wind and Truth. And with that, let's get into it. So right up front, as I was going through the night, two things stuck out at me. One, that Gavilar was a complete failure in basically everything he did. Whether it was in his legacy, whether it was in his role as a family man, or whether it was in his quest for immortality, he was a complete and utter failure. The other thing that stuck out at me was that Nail was actually more behind Gavilar's assassination than it appears at first brush. So with that, let's start with the preparations heading into the feast. The purpose of the feast heading into Gavilar's assassination already had two different motives. On the one hand, it's as it is presented, which is the nature of a treaty, the signing of a treaty, between the Kholinar house and the Parshendi. But what we learn through Venli's flashbacks is that it was actually her idea, not so much because of the treaty, but as a way to bring the Parshendi to the palace for them to be overwhelmed by the power of the Kholinar and the Alethi, and as a result, to have them actually turn away from the treaty that they were ostensibly signing. So we already, heading into the feast, have two different things going on here. So, as the preparations for the feast are kicking off, Navani is leading the Alethi side in preparing the entire event. She sees Aeswudan, who is Elkar's wife, talking to a master artifabrian. She learns that Dalinar has raided the wine stores. She has a conversation with a steward, all in the context of preparing for this feast. And while she's doing that, Gavilar, who is not helping Navani prepare, is instead speaking to the Stormfather, trying to find the words to become what he thinks will turn him into a herald. As the Alethi are preparing on their side, so are the Parshendi. Eshonai is unloading the drums that they brought from the Shattered Plains. She's noticing the Parshmen, she's encouraging them to enjoy the upcoming feast. And Venli, her sister, is sneaking around the hallways of the palace. And what is Venli doing? What she's doing is she's helping Ulim retrieve a bag of gemstones that Axwindet, basically that Venli and Ulim's agent in the palace, have left for them that are carrying more Voidspren from Braze. And Venli is quickly discovered sneaking around the palace during the course of the feast preparations and is arrested by an Alethi soldier. As they're doing this, Nail sees Ulim and recognizes him for what he is, which is a Voidspren. And so what Nail decides to do is seek out Venli to interrogate her about what this Voidspren is. And as he does so, he realizes that Gavilar has a plan of bringing Voidspren from Braze, that it's working, and Nail decides he needs to do something to stop this. What Nail does is that he tells Venli that there's a creepy slave for sale in the market, in the Alethi markets, and says that the listeners should use Zeth to kill Gavilar. And when he does so, Nail stalks off to confront Gavilar about what he's just learned, which we'll get to in a second. So let's turn back to Gavilar. So Gavilar has just met with Dalinar. He's manipulated Dalinar into drinking previously, which Navani noticed when she notices that all the wine is out. And now he's meeting Thydakar, aka, actually, spoilers for Mistborn, but aka Kelsier, who demands that Gavilar deliver Restaris, who we know is Kellic, one of the heralds, to him. And Gavilar at this stage is in way over his head. So after Kelsier or Thydakar makes this demand to Gavilar, he leaves, and who enters? Are Restaris himself and then Nail, who, as you'll remember, has just learned that Gavilar is bringing Voidspren from Braze. And so Nail and Ristaris try to confront Gavilar and try to convince him otherwise, but Gavilar, being the arrogant jerk that he is, basically refuses. He shows his fears that carry the void sprint to the Heralds, and he shows no sign of repentance. Navani, who at this stage is pretty fed up with trying to handle all the feast preparations on her own while Gavilar is like jaunting around, essentially heads to Gavilar's office, a steady, and overhears him talking to Nail and Ristaris. Gavilar tries to dismiss Nail and Ristaris and says something like, "We'll speak again," and Nail goes, "I don't think we shall," which we know now is because Nail has essentially set up Gavilar's assassination already before the feast has even started. Gavilar and Navani basically have a confrontation where Gavilar continues his string of being an arrogant jerk and essentially attacks Navani for not being the scholar that she thinks she is. When Gavilar leaves, Navani burns a glyph for death, gift, death, basically praying for Gavilar's death. Gavilar, whose wife is basically is hoping that he dies soon, heads off to his next meeting with Amaram and members of the Sons of Honor that Amaran has recruited. And who are these people? They include Taravangian himself, who hears and takes very seriously the concept of the Everstorm and the Night of Sorrows. Once Gavilar talks to his new recruits, he asks them to leave because he sees Eshonai, who at this point has stopped unloading drums and is poking around the palace, and he sees her outside of door and asks her to come in. And when he does, he shows her a fabrial and a sphere that glows with a black light that we now know is void light, and tells her to take it to the Five, which she does and goes running because she recognizes it as a way to restore the desolations. All right, moving on to phase 2, which is the actual feast. So the feast begins. Elokar and Aesrudan are presiding over the feast. Renarin is there, Adolin is there, Dalinar is there, although he's not yet fully drunk at this stage. And Nail and Kellic, after confronting Gavilar, have gone over to the high table and are sitting with Elokar. The Parshendi are not having fun. And why is that? It's because Eshonai has told them about Gavilar's plan to restore the gods. Nail has basically manipulated them into purchasing a slave, i.e. Szeth, and they put 2 and 2 together and decided that this is a sign that they should use the slave to assassinate Gavilar. So Szeth is now at this party, sitting in the back, being his weird, creepy self. Alright, so the feast is progressing. Dalinar is getting more and more drunk. Jasnah is listening to Dalinar's outbursts and then decides to leave the feast. And she notices Szeth, but kind of dismisses it as odd and just kind of keeps moving. And so Jasnah, as she wanders through the palace, sees Gavilar and Amaram speaking to each other. Both terrible dudes, one of whom is overly creepy towards her and one of whom is her father, who's a jerk towards her. And so Gavilar, who, is nasty to the second female relative of the night, returns to the party and then eventually retires, gets tired and returns to his rooms. And Jasnah continues moving through the palace. As she does so, the Inkspren try to communicate with her, and she almost gets pulled into Shadesmar, but then kind of rescues herself. And then she moves on to her meeting with an assassin that she's hired, Liz, who apparently has a shard blade. And Liz confirms that she just recently had Szeth as a slave, who she sold a few weeks ago in the Alethi marketplace. And Jasnah decides that she's hiring Liz to watch Aesrudan, Elokar's wife. The party is now winding down. Szeth has received orders from the Parshendi to murder Gavilar and starts getting up towards that goal, which then leads us into the next phase of the night, pre-assassination. As Szeth gets up and heads towards Gavilar's chambers, Dalinar is slump drunken, and Szeth passes the Beggar's Feast, where Jezrien, who is the king of the Heralds, is also slumped. Gavilar is back in his chambers, and he's unaware, entirely unaware, that an assassin is heading his way. Something crazy happens though, which is that the Stormfather feels the death of another herald. And that herald is Chanarak, who we now know was killed all the way in Jah Keved the same night of Gavilar's assassination, because Shallan conjures up a shard blade and kills her mother in self-defense. Back in Kholinar, Szeth is now fighting his way towards Gavilar's chambers. The alarm is raised, and Gavilar has time to change into his shard plate, while Sadeas takes on the king's robes and pretends to be the king. But by the time Szeth arrives at the chambers, he sees Sadeas, or what he initially thinks is the king, running, but Szeth, being a smarter, creepy but smart cookie, realizes this is actually a ploy, realizes the shard bearer in front of him, pretending to be the bodyguard, is Gavilar, and fights the shard bearer. While the fight is still ongoing, Jasnah arrives at Gavilar's chambers. And this is an interesting point here, because she arrives when Gavilar is still alive. Gavilar turns around and sees her. He looks right at her, and then he steps out onto the wooden balcony. Szeth had been on the wooden balcony. He had been lashing the balcony to try and break it, essentially. And so as Gavilar steps onto the wooden balcony, Szeth has essentially lashed it and pulled it downwards, and the whole balcony breaks, and Gavilar falls to what will be his death. But wait, Gavilar is mortally wounded, but not yet dead. He has the time to have a dying conversation with the Stormfather that Szeth interprets as Gavilar speaking to him. And so Gavilar gives this, what he thinks is to the Stormfather, but is actually to Szeth, a small crystalline sphere tied to a chain that glows with a black light. Szeth, thinking it's for him, takes it for himself. Gavilar is also trying to tell the Stormfather that to tell Dalinar to follow the path to potentially become a herald, and so find the most important words. And Szeth considers that Gavilar's wish to him, and writes that message for Dalinar in Gavilar's own blood while he lies dying. With that, Gavilar dies an underwhelming death, falling short of all of the dreams and aspirations he had heading into this feast, whether it was for a treaty with the Parshendi, whether it was for immortality for himself, or whether it was for himself to become a herald. The leaders of the Parshendi at this point have also arrived at the king's chambers, where they say Jasnah, and they basically admit to hiring Szeth to murder Gavilar. And then finally, Navani also arrives at the king's chambers and sees Gavilar's dead body. And the Parshendi leaders take blame for this assassination in order essentially to buy time for the rest of the Parshendi to escape from the palace. So what a ride. 2 major deaths this night, not just Gavilar, but also Chanarak, one of the heralds, and a lot of moving parts through the course of all of the nights at the palace with a lot of different characters. But what this actually ends up setting up is not so much about Gavilar, but is actually about Dalinar's emergence as a major character and a major driver of the events that follow Gavilar's assassination. And so whereas Gavilar died by his failures, whereas the knight was a failure, his legacy was a failure, his ambitions were a failure, his death actually triggers Dalinar to grow past his failures. Dalinar is forced to confront the fact that he lay slumped drunken when all of this stuff was playing out, and he lives by the codes that Szeth writes in Gavilar's blood as Gavilar lays dying, and eventually becomes the most pivotal character in the Stormlight Archive. And let's not let Nail get away with any of this. Nail is the one that it puts all of these events in motion by essentially suggesting to Venli and Ulim to hire Szeth to assassinate Gavilar. And so Nail, for all his talk and adherence to being the Herald of Justice and adherence to kind of the law of the land, is actually the one that drives one of the key illegal events that kick off the events of the Stormlight Archive. So hopefully this breakdown has been useful to you and pulled together a lot of different threads that happened over the course of that night. And let me know, please, in the comments if you felt like there was anything that I didn't describe that was particularly important that happened, or if you took anything away from this in hearing kind of the full story in chronological order. And if you like this kind of content, please hit like and please subscribe to this video. I keep posting as regularly as I can on all things Cosmere. Thanks, everyone.